Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Today, our guest is Blake Snow. Blake has written as a journalist for half of the top 20 U.S. media outlets like CNN, Wired, USA Today, and he advises Fortune 500 companies on their content strategy. He's a blogger, musician, he loves to travel, and he's the author of 2 books, Log Off, How to Stay Connected After Disconnecting, and Measuring History, How One Unsung Company Quietly Changed the World, which is the story of National Instruments, a company you probably haven't heard of, but which has undoubtedly changed your life. We'll learn a little bit more about that. Blake, welcome to the show.
Josh, thanks so much for having me. I love writing books and I love talking about books. So it's just, I feel at home, and I'm excited for our discussion today about this book and kind of what I've learned through this process.
And full disclosure for the audience, Blake is a friend of mine. We go way back. We met in Provo, Utah. I think we are probably still both students, or maybe just recently after graduation.
Just right out of college, it seems like. I think I met you, Josh. It was mid-aughts, I think, I would say. Mid to early aughts, I think, is when I met you. And so the audience knows Josh has always been a very generous, giving guy, as you've probably seen on the podcast and with his work and his lifestyle. And so that certainly has permeated through my 15-year relationship knowing Josh. So
now the funny thing is that today we're both writers. We've both written for all these big name publications. We both have books out. But when we met, I'm not sure either of us saw ourselves as writers. So for the audience's sake, give us your story a little bit. Where do you come from? What's your background? Where'd you grow up? And how did you become the writer that you are today?
Yeah, that's a great question, Josh. I was born to a college professor and a homemaker. My mother and my dad has always been in academia. So he grew up in academic writing, which I have been in arguments with him, is very stuffy and boring, and I want to tell him the ways that I write, but I think he could do way better academically, but that's neither here nor there. So I was raised by a writer. I didn't know that I liked writing or wanted to pursue writing until my final semester of college. I grew up in Oklahoma and Georgia, spent my childhood in Oklahoma, my adolescence in Georgia. And then I after serving a mission for my church for 2 years in Brazil, went to school at BYU here in Utah in Provo. And I had some really bad English teachers in my undergraduate studies. I never connected. And so early on, I felt like I don't like writing. This isn't for me. I don't even want to touch this. And so I had to do one last writing class for college. And I deferred it to the very last semester. It was a business writing class, and I deferred it because I thought I wouldn't like it. I didn't want to do it. So I just procrastinated it. So I get in this class, and this college professor says, for this class, I want you to write about what interests you, what topics and subjects interest you. You can write about whatever you want. I just want to help you pursue those topics and help you be a better writer. And that just kind of flipped the switch for me. It just changed everything. I was like, well, I got a lot of passions and hobbies. Let's write about those. And so I started doing that. And this is early aughts. So blogging was like, the cool thing back then. And so I started writing, I started a blog, and I was covering all these topics that I was interested in, mainly technology and entertainment. And so after that, I started blogging. 6 months after that, I was hired by a company called AOL, which used to be a pretty big deal, online and in content.
A tiny little company that some people may have heard of called AOL. Yeah, it's kind of funny how it's faded from our consciousness,
totally.
Right? It's like,
that used to be a big deal. They would, for all the old schoolers out there, they'd send those. I think they sent like something like 100 million CDs per year during the early web days, and so they were a huge deal. So got hired by them to do blogging, and I did that just kind of moonlighting, side hustling, for I want to say about a year full time, and then I jumped full time in 2006 to a freelance writer. Did that for the next 3-4 years for mainstream media, news media. And then the Great Recession hit about 10, 11 years ago. And all those freelance budgets just shriveled up. And so at that time I was like, man, I still want to write. I got to do something. And content marketing started becoming a thing. And so I started getting hired by Fortune 500 companies to do very similar pieces of work, feature articles, explanatory journalism, how AI works, all that kind of stuff. I just started doing it on behalf of companies that aligned with those topics. And so I've been doing that ever since. Like you said, in between then, I wrote a couple books, and I think that's kind of at least how I got to where I am today, the short version, at least professionally.
Was there a day where you kind of stepped back and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm a writer. I never thought of myself as a writer before. Was there like a day when or was it more of a gradual thing?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think I wrote so much at the beginning just for free on my blog, just as I was honing my craft and cutting my teeth. And I knew I was getting good because there was, I started a few blogs and I was getting a following. So I knew I was able to connect with people, but it was probably that first check. I think it was like, I don't know, for like $700 or something from AOL. And I was like, I busted my butt for that $700, but that's when it really dawned on me that like, wow, like I'm getting paid to ask questions and write. This is ridiculous. It was amazing. And so that was probably the first time that it really dawned on me. And it was a proud moment. And to be honest, Josh, anytime I get a check or someone pays me to write, it's like a dream come true, because I would do this for free and I still do it for free. I have a blog that I don't have advertising on, and it's like a labor of love. And so to be able to get paid for something that I do and would do for free, it's a really self-gratifying experience.
So we were talking about this before. I mean, this COVID thing is kind of a dream come true for antisocial people who like to hole up and just stay in their home office all the time. And it kind of has been that for me. Like, I'm kind of like, I don't really want to say this out loud, but I'm kind of loving this. Like, I don't have to go to any meetings or anything. It's great. But for you were saying that's not exactly your lifestyle to be a shut-in like some of us other writers.
No, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm an extrovert. I'm a social butterfly. So this kind of prohibition on touch and socialization has been really tough for me. But like you, there have been some really good things that have came out of this isolation. And I kind of feel like I've been able to kind of embrace my more introverted side, which I think all of us have. I have been able to curate and, nurture that side of my personality and do some things that otherwise I wouldn't have done had it just been business as usual 2020. But yeah,
like your second book, right?
Do what?
Like your second book, or did you have the book done?
Yeah. Yeah, like that was already in the works, but I'd probably say the second half of it, or a big brunt of it, was finished in this new year. And I actually finished this, like I said before the show, Josh, that I actually finished this book the day the world, at least America, shut down on Friday the 13th was kind of when I finished. Obviously I had a lot of revisions and editing work to do after that, which, brings us here to the fall. I had to do a lot of that this summer, but yeah, the bulk of it was done at the start of this year.
Yeah. So take us to your first book. What was the inspiration for writing Log Off?
The first book it's a self-help memoir, Josh. I think you've read it. We talked about it. That book, I kind of say that book changed my life in that, before there was a time in my life, like many, self-employed or entrepreneurs or, early 20 somethings, I was addicted to my identity as a professional. And so I was a workaholic. I couldn't break away, just consumed by it. I think by my last count, like I was online and like working probably for over 3,000 consecutive days. It was like years of it, just an addiction to that lifestyle. And so something switched. I took this family vacation up in Montana, just outside of Yellowstone. And, there's still spots in America where there's no cell service, only dial-up modem, speaking of AOL. And that was the experience for me about 11 years ago. We went on this trip, and it was a week-long trip. And at first I thought I was going to hate it, but then that trip changed me. I was like, I want to be able to do this. What can I do? What kind of changes can I make in my life to, kind of capture what we've captured here on this vacation? And that basically started with like killing all my alerts and notifications, turning my smartphone into a dumb phone, and just really setting strict boundaries on when I work. And so then I tested all these things, and I wrote them up in a kind of self-help memoir called Log Off, where I talk about the things that I did to get what I argue is offline balance and just better fulfillment, better productivity, just a much more happier state. I mean, a lot of people have found this path, but this is the way I found the path, and that's what that first book is about.
So what was your process like for writing that? Because you have all this experience blogging and writing articles, which are shorter form content, and then you're writing this long book. Were there things that were unexpected or that surprised you or that you found that you had to adapt to, or was it pretty easy to make the transition?
Yes, for the first book especially, Josh, it was going from short to medium form writing to a long form as a book was harder in that like when you write a web article, you try to do a beginning, middle, and the end, but it's just much more easy to do that if it's condensed into 600 or 1,000 words or 1,200 words or whatever it be. You can kind of see that picture and that story arc a little easier in that short form. So when I had the idea for the book, I started writing it. Loved basically the first few chapters remained untouched. That's what I wrote, and I did that. And then I hit a wall. I hit writer's block. I didn't know how to take this long form story through act 2. And then I kind of knew where I wanted to end on act 3. I just didn't know how to bridge the starting and ending act, if you will. And so I think I went probably a year or two, Josh, where I didn't even touch the first book. It was really tough.
I remember that because I kept bugging you about it. I was like, when are you going to get this book done? You're like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And like you, I had other colleagues that were bugging me, and it was good. It was helpful. So then I figured out, I got it. I know where I want to go. I started writing again. And then there was another bout of writer's block as well. Probably not quite as long, but maybe 6 to 8 months. And so it was tough for me. After that, I crushed it. I finished the book in I want to say I did 50%, the remaining 50% of the book in I think it was maybe 4 or 5 weeks. It all just flowed out. And so that first book was the process of learning how to do long form. Not so much with the second book. It was a lot easier. I mean, giving one book under your belt, you're kind of like, oh, I'm an author now. And so I identified it as an author, and I knew I could author a book. And so it's much easier. So for any of the listeners out there, wanting to write a first book, it is a big challenge. But one thing that did help me, despite my writer's block, was this whole concept of don't try to write a book, write one chapter and then the next chapter. Try to break it up into bite-sized things that you can accomplish. That was way easier for me to do with the second book than the first, but that advice I think stands regardless for anyone that's interested in publishing a book. You have to break it up. Now, granted, you're going to be forced to draft a compelling outline or a story arc and how you want to get there. So that is tough. You can't really break that up into bite-sized chunks, and you got to have some good foresight in terms of where you need to head. But you can break things up. And so instead of writing a book, I was like, let's write 1,000 words today. Let's write 1,000 words this day. And so anyone can do that. You can break things up. And what I found with writing 2 books is, and most, as with all things in life, it really is about momentum. And if you can keep that momentum, you won't stall out as long or as twice as I did or as hard as I did in my first book. So it's all about that momentum, creating bite-sized chunks, just sticking to it and not being afraid to fail or, throwing stuff out. There's several chapters that I would start, sort of liked it. And then I was like, no, this is wrong. You have to just delete and start over. And that's totally okay. And that's normal. And you're human if you do that. And so even for me as a writer, and I'm sure you've been through that as well, Josh. So those are some things that really helped me finishing these 2 books.
So I've heard people say, and this seems to work for me when I actually follow this advice, that your first draft should be junk. It should be a trash draft that nobody else sees, and that you should not edit your first draft as you're going along. I really struggle with this because I have a tendency to edit everything I write as I'm going along through it.
Yeah.
How did you apply or not apply that with your first book? Did you just get everything out, or were you editing as you went along?
I disagree with that advice, and I understand that some people, that makes sense and it's basically what works for you. But for me, that doesn't work for you. Now, I'm not a big fan of like nitty gritty editing, Josh, but I am a big fan of like writing something that I'm proud of, that entertains me or that speaks to me. Like first and foremost, I write for myself. If I know that I don't like it, I'm pretty sure no one else is going to like it. And so that I use that as a litmus test of like, how good is my current writing, the page right in front of me. So while I don't do the nitty gritty granular editing, copy editing, I'm okay making typos and all that. I do need the flow and sentences and the structure to be compelling and interesting for me to want to read it. And so that's the approach I take. I actually do write a chapter in a way that is not junk. I'm trying to, maybe not necessarily this is the final chapter, the final piece, but I'm certainly trying to write something that's compelling that I want to read and ultimately share with someone. So that's the approach I take when I write chapters. And I've been asked this a lot, like, what is a writer? And I feel like, and I'm sure you've seen this too, Josh, where you just, I basically like to say I write sentences for a living. That's really, if you want to get to the nitty gritty of what I do, it's writing sentences. It's that word's wrong, this word's wrong. And so it's constantly reworking those sentences. And there's a lot of famous writers that talk about that it's all about the sentence structure and then adding a sentence onto another, and you create a paragraph and then you move to the next sentence. So that's the approach I take when I write, whether it's a book or an article.
Who are some of those favorite famous writers that you look up to?
Oh, that's a great question. I really like Twain. He probably, when I read Tom Sawyer, I was like, this is brilliant. And that's just a short book. And he certainly has other books, more popular ones, even Huck Finn. But that turned me on to this idea that you write in a way that you should, like, so many people ask me, like, Blake, how do you write? And I would argue that a mark of an amateur writer is you try to be formal and stuffy and serious, and this is how writing should sound. And I completely disagree. And Twain is the perfect example of that. It's like, no, you should write like you talk. You should write in a way that's interesting for people to engage and listen to and interact with. And so that's the approach I take. So he's one. I think I also really respect Laura Hillenbrand. And so I wouldn't call myself a genius writer by any stretch of the imagination, Josh. I think I'm a really good to great writer, but there's that 1% of writers that are genius, and she's one of them. She did Unbroken, Seabiscuit, and I think those are the only 2 books she's ever done. And so she's this genius that holds up, creates these incredible masterpieces, and then just releases them, and they blow up around the world because she's absolutely amazing. So she's one of a modern one. My favorite web article, my favorite like magazine article of all time is Frank Sinatra Has a Cold by Guy Talese. It's an awesome article written for Esquire. You can just Google it and you can find it. Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. That is that kind of fly on the wall writing where it's utterly fascinating to read that. So he's just one, I think, old school magazine writer. There's a lot. I mean, I do read, I wouldn't say as many as like other people. I have friends that read 100 books a year. I'm more closer to maybe like 10 on average, maybe not quite one a month is what I seem to average out. And I don't even watch Netflix or watch a lot of TV. It's kind of what I typically do, is about one a month on average that I read.
So where did the inspiration then come for the second book? There are a few years there in between.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious to get the answer on this, because this book is a book where when I was reading the description, I was like, why would anybody write this book? Like, why would Blake write this book? And yet I'm sure it's great. And I'm sure there was something that captured you about it that you're like, I've got to write this story. So I'm really curious to hear where the inspiration for it came from.
So this wasn't supposed to, Measuring History wasn't supposed to be my second book, Josh. I got a couple other book ideas, and I was actually starting work on my second book that I had this idea for. And this lady contacts me and she's like, Blake, I'm familiar with your work. I've seen your first book. I work with this company, and I'm wondering if you consider writing a book about this company. And I was like, well, I need to know a lot more. So the answer is no, unless you can help me kind of get some more answers, because I'm not going to do anything that I'm not passionate about, that I don't believe in, that isn't interesting or compelling for me. And she's like, okay, well, I'd love you to interview a couple of our founders and just ask some questions, and you can speak to some other senior executives and just get an idea of kind of what the history of this book is. So I do my due diligence. I start talking to these people, and when I discovered that this company, this not little, but an unheard of company from Austin, Texas, has had the amount of influence they've had on the world. I mean, it's anywhere from 60 to 80% by some estimates, according to kind of what daily products you use. I kind of felt like I'd stumbled on an untold story. And, for a journalist or a writer, that's what we live for. I mean, it makes our job easier to be able to have something that at least not the wider world knows about, to be able to share that with them. So once it became apparent, like, wow, there's an untold story here, I was totally on board. And, this was a way different process than my first book. My first book is that self-help memoir where I coupled my own personal research, tinkering, my own kind of lifestyle changes and behaviors with the story of how I converted, to find offline balance. Whereas this was a lots of interviews. I conducted over 70 kind of formal official interviews with analysts and competitors, and a lot of people within the company, both past and present, and then, hundreds of emails and follow-up calls. So this was a lot of reporting and original research to get this story told, which was a lot of fun as well. So I'd say with this book, it was supposed to, I'd mapped out, okay, this will take me 12 months to do it all. With COVID, it actually took me 14. I mean, COVID did slow things up for a couple months, and it ruined our book launch party. It was supposed to be a big book launch and a signing event. That's all, it got ruined, but it's getting pushed hopefully till early next year, kind of depending on how much the world opens up. So that was disappointing, but yeah, it got delayed. But I'd say that probably 5-6 months was just reporting, interviewing, asking questions, follow-up questions, getting the story right. And then as I started writing it, I would fact check it. Hey, is this right? So it was a much more collaborative experience to tell this story.
That is fascinating. That's super interesting. So give us the short version. What is National Instruments? What do they do? And what was the untold story?
Yeah, so they make test and measurement software and hardware. That's a fancy word for when an engineer designs a computer monitor, a pair of Air Jordans, a basketball. They need instruments to take measurements on if that product is going to perform or live up to what the specifications are, what it was designed to do. Like same thing with an engine, a jet engine, or your transmission in your car. So all of these examples and many, many more use National Instruments to test, to make sure that the engineering, that the product, the manufacturing is working as it was intended to. At the same time, people use National Instruments like NASA or Boeing to make sure that the airplane is staying in the air and doing as it's supposed to, and there's no bleeping red lights alerting someone to an emergency, or getting a rocket up in space. And so it's both their software and hardware help manufacture products as they were designed, but also keep running products such as your antenna and your iPhone, make sure that that's connecting and working properly. And if it's not, it'll send an error to your software. So there are some other companies, but what put them on the map is they were the first to use computers, in this case, personal computers back in the 80s, to start letting engineers and researchers and scientists do their own tests at a very affordable, cheap, fast way. And so that just put them on this trajectory. I mean, even now, if you see some NASA videos, you'll see a little National Instruments logo, on their screen. And I think the new, what's the Tesla guys, SpaceX, like their whole control panel is a National Instruments panel that they helped use. So it's basically nerdy behind the scenes software and hardware that just makes the products that we use in everyday life just better functioning and keep them working. And so that's the story, is how that started, like where they came up with that idea, what it's done over the past, several decades. And then for them, as the world's changing, and this is kind of a commodity now, kind of personalized test and measurement. And as we move to mobile, they're facing, kind of an inflection point where they need to decide how they're going to change, how they're going to adapt to help engineers moving forward. So I think that's the summation of that story. It's really character driven. I'm really proud of it, Josh, that, when they first approached me, and I'm doing all these interviews, Josh, as a writer, and this, I'm like, there's not a lot of conflict here, guys. There's not like this Steve Jobs personality that they're getting in boardroom fights or they almost risk the company on this huge loan. It's a pretty boring, there's not a lot of controversy in their history. So I was like, I need conflict to tell the story. So how am I going to do this? And so I tried different pathways. Like, no, there's really not a lot of conflict there. I wasn't going to force the issue. So I decided on this alternating timeline to tell the story, this narrative where it starts in present day, then I go back 40 years, comes back to present day in chapter 3, then I go back 35 years. And so I just worked my way up till everything built up to the final chapter, and it really paid off really nicely. I'm excited. I'm really pleased and happy with how that alternating timeline really created that, not so much conflict, but the tension to kind of lead the reader along to get to the final chapter. So I'm really proud of that. And I had to use that trick, and that is a trick. There's tricks you'll have to use as a writer. If there's not a lot of conflict, you're going to have to find an interesting way to keep the reader suspended or the listener suspended. And that worked really well in this book for me.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that insight. That's something I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah.
So this book was kind of an exercise in long form journalism, it sounds like.
Totally. I mean, it completely is. And right before I started this project, I read this great book called Say Nothing about the troubles in Northern Ireland. Have you heard of this book, Josh?
I think I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
It's great. Yeah, it's a great story on just the Irish IRA and how messed up that was, and how, like, that's crazy, Josh, that story that, people, they look alike, they talk alike, there's no racial or inequality stuff, and they still hate each other just based on what they believe spiritually. And so there's a lot. The reason I bring that up is because that author, I'm forgetting his name. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. Just had to do a lot of deep, reporting as well that I had to do for this story. So that was an inspiration for me reading that book. And you're certainly right. This was a long form, journalistic story that I had to tell that required a lot of reporting, interviewing, and original research. But that's also what was so exciting. It was also interesting, Josh, to see, for example, I interviewed the two co-founders, and just to see how memory fails the human mind. Like, the both of them, like, they lived this story and they would slightly disagree, not on big issues, but it was like, well, I gotta tell one of these truths, which is the most true. And as you'll see in the books, there's cases where I say, this guy said this said this. We don't know the real story, but that's where we go from here. And so that was an interesting thing to kind of be confronted with, that, your memory fails, Josh, mine does too. It's just human nature, because our brains throw away stuff that it deems as, this isn't really that important, but it is important when we try to retell the past and revisit the history of how we got to where we are. So,
yeah. So what's next? You said you're working on some other books. What have you got in the works?
Well, I've been toying with, like, this idea of how a lot of people ask me, I've been working for myself now for close to 2 decades, about 20 years. And people asking me, how did you do it? It seems so hard, kind of like writing a book. I think to a lot of people who've never been a self-employed or an entrepreneur, it's like mind-boggling. It's like, it seems like a lot of people that have never done that, like, their biggest concern is, like, health insurance. I'm like, oh, that's the last of your concern. But I think it just shows how different kind of a shift or plane you're on. And so for me, how have I been able to do that for the past 20 years? And the big thing that's really blessed my life and my work is just persistence. I do what's called politely persistent. That's what I'm constantly trying to do. And I think everyone does this. At least a lot of the people that are successful, they know that, it's your job, it's our job to get out there and ask people and face rejection time and time again. So the next book will likely be something around persistence and how that's helped me in my life. I'll also do a lot of, reporting and research on that subject and how people could adapt a more persistent approach to work and life. But that's the next thing and at least book idea that I've had. But then I've got this list of like, here's a few other ideas. I don't know if they're book worthy, but I need to explore them a little more to see if, there is a story there. And I think there's a book length of material there to be told. So I plan on writing lots of books. It's a great experience. At the same time, it's kind of my editor of my first book. He's edited 60 or 70 books. So quite a few books. He's been doing it for a long time. And he told me, and I haven't never fact checked this, but I have no reason to dispute it. He said, the number of books being published is something like half today of where it was just 10, 15 years ago. So people are still reading, but Netflix and, episodic content is eating into the mainstream's, consumption of books. So I'm not going to say it's a dying medium by any stretch of the imagination. It's still very popular. But it is, it's interesting to see, a little sad, I would say, but it's also interesting to see just how reading has kind of dwindled a little. But on the upside, a lot more people are listening to books. Audible is a huge thing. So it's not all lost, but it's interesting to see the industry change.
For sure. What's your preferred form of consuming books these days?
I like it on my Kindle. So I like ebooks. It's short. So I prefer to read it on my Kindle, but I love that I have the Kindle app. And if I'm away from my Kindle, I just fire it up on my phone and it syncs, so I'm right where I'm at. And so it's a really great way to just consume books throughout your day. So I feel like I'm reading better that. At the same time, I'll still read a hard copy. My wife still prefers hard copies. I know a lot of people do. I actually don't like Audible books. I would rather read it, but I get that a lot of people do. I don't really care how you consume my book. If you do, great. But I prefer ebook. What about you, Josh? How do you like to read?
Well, I think that I used to be a huge audiobook fan, and that was the only way I consumed books. And I got converted back to print books within the past year. And so my whole bookshelf, if you're watching this on video, you see all the books behind me. Like these are just the books that I bought in like the last 6 months. Yeah. And so I've kind of gotten addicted, and I blame Ryan Holiday for this, because Ryan Holiday, his research method for writing his books is he marks up a bunch of print books. And when I started working on my newer set of books, I realized audio doesn't work for this, because I want to bookmark things and it's not convenient when I'm out jogging to like stop, get my phone out, mark it. And then how do I process those marks? I was like, this is not working. So I looked at Ryan Holiday's method and I thought, you know what? I'm going to have to do this. And then I got addicted to it. And so now I'm just churning through print books.
Yeah, that's something I didn't really realize. Like I actually get a little anxiety when I'm reading a nonfiction book. I mean, I take great breaks from my phone, but I love having my phone by me with my Kindle, because I'm always making these mental notes, writing notes. Oh, pursue that, read more on this subject. And so that makes perfect sense as to why you converted. That's a big part of why I like to read. Either Kindle or paperback as well.
Yeah. I mean, paper is it's user friendly for some stuff in ways that technology isn't. So I do tend to still listen to a lot of audiobooks, but it's books that aren't part of my research. So I just read Moby Dick because I watched In the Heart of the Sea and I thought, well, I want to read Moby Dick now. I've never read it. Well, I don't need to mark that up. I just want to listen to it for fun. And so that's the type of book that I'm listening to.
How many stars out of 5 would you give Moby Dick, Josh?
Have you read it?
I have. So I want to know yours first.
So if I'm being harsh, I'll give it 4 out of 5 stars. And the only reason I wouldn't give it 5 out of 5 is I hated the way it ended, because I thought it was too abrupt. I got to the end and I was like, I didn't know where I was in the book. So I wasn't watching the timeline. I was just out running and I get to the end of the book and it's like, we hope you enjoyed this Blackstone audio production. I was like, wait, what? Like, it's over? I was like, no, I thought I was like halfway through it and it's over. And I was like, it was just getting good.
And a lot of classic books do that. They end so abruptly, almost like it's almost like, guys, you can't mic drop quite that quick. You gotta like let people like process what's going on. I agree with you. I give it 4 out of 5. A great, really important book, but slightly overrated, I would say. And I love going back to read classics. And I think a lot of classics leave me scratching my head. I'm like, how is this so popular? And maybe it was a product of the times, I think, in a lot of cases. Whereas some classics, I'm like, this is absolutely amazing. Like Count of Monte Cristo, like Alexander Dumas is one of the greatest. You asked me about authors, just amazing with words. But at the same time, I read that unabridged version, Josh, at page, I think it's like 775. I'm like, Dumas, where are you going with this? How did you do this? And I learned, Josh, I don't know if you knew this, he got paid episodically. So he was financially incentivized to go off on these divergent side paths where as a whole work, it does the work a disservice. So if you're ever going to read Count of Monte Cristo, do the abridged version, save yourself some trouble. So.
Yeah, I've heard similar things about Les Mis and stuff. I mean, he goes off for like 200 pages about this war, and you're like,
what?
Wow, like this is a lot of building out the background here. Like,
did he get paid episodically too?
I heard that. I'm not sure if that's true, but I heard a rumor like that.
Yeah.
But I really actually liked Moby Dick. I came into it with low expectations. I thought it would be boring. And then it turned out to be very funny and entertaining. And his sense of humor just caught me off guard. I was like, this is not at all what I was expecting to get into. And so I ended up really enjoying the kind of the joke.
That's great. I mean, that's great. And I love that you read those, Josh. That's actually this like pro tip that I've learned in my life, that don't just stay in the weeds. Like if you're going to write a business book, I hope you're reading classics. I hope you're reading literature. I hope you're reading novels. Because as you expand your intake of reading, you're just going to be a better writer all around. And so that's certainly helped me. So I'm a big advocate of consuming all types of writing, and you'll learn tricks. Like there's times where I like reading Dumas. I'm like, man, I love how he said that. I'm going to try to say that in a story I'm writing, an article I'm writing, a book I'm writing. And so I'm a big advocate of don't just stay in your lane when it comes to reading. You really need to expand and read all sorts of writers, all types of genres.
So glad you dropped that tip in here, because I agree 100%. Well, Blake, thank you so much for coming on the show here. Where's the best place for people to learn more about you?
Yeah, you can go to my website, blakesnow.com. There you'll find links to my, both books, a lot of my, the articles I contribute around the web, and just some of the work that I do as a content consultant and as a writing consultant to a lot of companies. And so that's a great start. You can also search me up on Amazon. If you look for my books, just search Blake Snow. You should see them pull up there. Reach out, say hi, give me an email. You can do that at inbox@blakesnow.com. Happy to answer any questions as well. Thanks for having me on the show, Josh. It's great to catch up.
You too. Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.